Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're talking about critical perspectives, critical approaches, and today's discussion is Marxist criticism. Marxist criticism is not Marxism per se. However, it is rooted in the understanding and the ideas of Karl Marx in terms of his ideas about art and what it is and what it is not. Essentially, based on the social philosophies of Marx, he saw art not as a way of expressing oneself, but as a commodity, just like everything else was. And as part of that, he began to analyze anything that is produced as one of several things, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Marxist criticism can be applied generally in three ways. I'm going to talk about these three ways separately, and keep in mind that you could write three different paragraphs in which you discuss Marxist criticism of a particular work in these different particular ways. The first type of Marxist criticism is essentially a discussion of class struggle. And that is, you would identify a class struggle within the work, and generally when that happens, one class is going to be presented in a better light than other class or classes. For example, something written from the middle class is very often going to extol the virtues of the hard work and moral ethic of the middle class. That the values of having a job and raising children and having these generally identified middle-class values is a positive thing. They might present the upper class as being snobbish, as being overly well-fed and overly well taken care of, as people who do not have to work very hard for a living or do not have to work at all. And they would present the lower class as people who don't work as hard as the middle class, people who are undeserving, people who might even be trying to leech off of the middle class. This can happen from any class distinction to the other, and sometimes the class is not necessarily socioeconomic, it might be something else. Certainly, certain musical works identify one class from another, even within a genre, who's more rock and roll, or what's real punk, or what's real hip-hop, or rap, or whatever. And certainly the arguments between the gangster rap and other forms of hip-hop is a class argument. When one group says, hey, we're more hardcore, more real than you are, that is a class discussion. As part of that, you need secondary sources that discuss what the two classes are and what defines them, and therefore helps you to identify not only the class that is being presented as the more positive one, but also explains how the person is using specific identifiers to point out what's good and what's bad, because what's good and what's bad depends on the class in which someone finds themselves. A second version of this, or a second type of Marxist criticism, actually has to do with looking at the work itself as a product. And the idea is that when an author writes something or does something, they're sending a message. This type of Marxist criticism is going to look at the audience and the author's intent to reach the audience. And this manifests itself in one of two ways, and one of those ways is called pandering. Pandering essentially occurs when an author uses a work and tries to appeal to the audience in one of two ways. Either the work itself is going to appeal to the audience in order to sell a product, in order to sell the work itself, or the message is pandering to an audience and its sensibilities. And sometimes those are used together in a single work. For example, anybody who's aware of what the PMRC was and how it came about knows it was this group of fairly socially conservative people, Democrats, Republicans alike, although Tipper Gore gets most of the credit for that. And the deal was that they all got together and they said they had problems with mostly what was rap music and heavy metal music at the time in terms of its imagery and its use of language. What happened is that the rap industry and the heavy metal industry was pandering to its audience. In other words, it knew what its audience wanted in terms of musical tone, language, storyline, character, all that other kind of stuff, and was presenting that. Once they came out with a sticker that basically said, parental advisory, this work may be unsuitable for children, record sales went up. And that's because if you're really into rap music and you really like hardcore heavy metal, you want something that frightens your parents. And in actuality, what authors began to do was to incorporate profanity and drug use and blatant sexuality into their works in order to get that rating, because they realized that that would get work to fly off the shelves. Same thing happens in movies. Most movie makers want an R rating. And the reason they want an R rating is because it adds credibility. They know young people are going to sneak into the movie to see it, and also adults are going to go see it. Adults don't like seeing anything that has PG or especially a G-rated movie. They consider it's not adult content. At the same time, they don't want it to get into NC-17 or X. In fact, NC-17 was created to create an adult movie that was essentially not straight-up pornography. But it has backfired. In other words, it hasn't worked because, again, the notion is that if you see that rating, you figure it's too much. Well, directors know how to do this. They know the number of, specifically the number of F-bombs they need to throw into that work to get it over to that R rating, the amount of violence they need to get over to that R rating, or if they're trying to pander to a teen audience, the number that they can put in there to keep it in the PG-13 rating. This is all done in a very manufactured way, and Marxist criticism appropriately points out that when somebody's creating a work, that very often they keep the audience in mind and they're presenting something to them that they like. This has to do with structure. When we get to the elements of the message itself, when you look at something in hip-hop that says living in the inner city is difficult, or a country western song that extols the virtues of being an American, or a rock and roll song that extols the virtues of being a rebel, those authors may be talking about how they really feel, but more importantly, they know exactly who their audience is, and they're pandering to them by sending them a message that they know the audience is going to agree with. They know the audience is going to like it. And when you're analyzing lyrics especially, but also movies, television, anything like that, you're taking into account all of these elements. How do, what is the message to a particular audience, and how is that audience being catered to in terms of the style, in terms of the material itself, in terms of the message of the material, and the like. Your secondary sources are going to be, obviously, information about what that audience likes and dislikes, what the audience is looking for, what the audience buys. You'll also find secondary source material on a description of what the primary source is and how it's structured. If it's a song, what's the music like? What's the style? What's the profanity level? What do these terms mean to a particular group of people? And those are the kinds of things that you would use. The opposite of that, or the other side of that, actually, is in the same vein, and it's called propagandizing. Propagandizing generally occurs, we use the term propaganda in this way anyway, generally occurs when somebody is talking to an audience that either disagrees with or is unaware of the message that the speaker is sending. In other words, an author is going to create a work that essentially is telling somebody something that they do not want to hear or they did not expect to hear. Certainly anybody who's familiar with the material of U2 is familiar with the lead writer, Bono's feelings about inequality, about civil rights all around the world. And initially his work was all focused on the troubles in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. But once they became a world band, he began focusing on the same kinds of issues in terms of strong-arm governments and nightly raids and righteous rebels and all this kind of stuff in places like South America, Africa, and the like. He is pandering to his audience that already agrees with him politically, but he's also propagandizing to an audience that may like the music of U2, but does not necessarily agree with him politically. And what he's doing is he's drawing them in with the music, and then he's telling them a message about how he feels, and in some ways, how he thinks they should respond and how they should act. Very often an author will, in some ways, draw you in with a little bit of pandering with the style, musical style. Oh, I like this, it sounds good. And then they'll beat you over the head with some message that you may or may not be ready or willing to listen to. Propagandizing, again, like pandering, requires that you identify the audience, and you identify the audience sensibilities and their belief system, and then explain how the work is addressing an argument against those sensibilities. And certainly what happens is when you get so-called rebels within a scene, that's often what happens. People like Ted Nugent, for example, is a very strong right-wing sensibility guy. He's in a rock and roll field where a large number of people tend to see themselves as more progressive on a lot of levels, or they just simply don't care about things like politics. And he draws them in with righteous guitar playing and stuff like this. And then if you go to one of his shows, he's going to stop at some point and explain to you why he plays American guitars and how he feels about American politics and about guns and all these other kinds of things. And he wears those things very, very blatantly. On the other hand, you get somebody like Bruce Springsteen from the same era, and in some ways a different sensibility for sure. He identifies himself as a blue-collar guy. He's from New Jersey, and that's the way his parents were raised and stuff like this. He's never worked a blue-collar job in his life, but he still identifies with that. And he says, I'll never have to do it, my kids will never have to do that, but he still identifies with that. And when he writes songs, it's from that blue-collar mentality that basically says that a lot of things America has done has been very bad for the middle-class person, especially the working-class person. And these arguments are presented in their work. So you might be listening to Bruce Springsteen and and Ted Nugent in the same thing. Oh, I like them both. They're telling you two completely different things politically about how things are and the way things should be. And by careful listening, you begin to realize, wow, this is he's propagandizing to these people and he's pandering to these people. And what I want you to do, if you're going to discuss both of those things in an essay, separate them into two paragraphs, because we're talking about two different audiences, two different sensibilities, and it helps you really to flesh this idea out. Marxist criticism is important. I do not want discussions of Marxism. I don't need to hear about Karl Marx or Engels or the Russian Revolution, any of that kind of stuff. It's not Marxism. It is a discussion of how work is seen as a commodity and is often seen as polemic. It's seen as a speech and is seen as a way to influence people, whether it is simply a demonstration of class struggle or if it's actually speaking to a particular audience and either telling them what they want to hear or telling them what they don't want to hear. Keep these things in mind. Make sure you have your secondary sources to support whatever approach that you're taking, and make sure you identify which Marxist approach you're using as you introduce the paragraph. All right? Stay in touch.